Hi, my name is Diane Lalonde. I am a research and knowledge mobilization specialist with the Learning Network. I am a white woman with brown hair and brown eyes. I'm wearing a brown striped shirt in a room that's primarily filled of books and cat toys. If you hear a cat meowing, my black cat Midnight is next to me. And on behalf of the Learning Network, I want to welcome you to our resource spotlight that is on disabled sexuality and pleasure access. We want to start with land acknowledgement. And so I am on the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Lenape, the Haudenosaunee, and the Chongaton nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. And we make this acknowledgement in order to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. And so we will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that are pervasive in Canada. And we're so happy to be joined today by Rachele Manett. Rachele is a queer and disabled educator, certified therapeutic recreation specialist, and the host of That Sex Show on AMI TV. Their work focuses on sexuality, disability, and access. And they are currently the education coordinator for Venus Envy, which is an education-based sex shop and bookstore with locations in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Ottawa, Ontario. And how the spotlight works is that we're first going to have a presentation, and then we're going to move into the Q&A. So Rachele, I'll invite you to put your video audio on, and I'll stop sharing so that you can share your own slides too.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. See if I can multitask while doing this. There we go. Okay, everyone can see that. We're set. All right. So yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. My name's Rachele. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. And I am a white, very pale white femme. I'm sitting in my office. I have, which is not a very exciting office. There's like a bookcase behind me and some books and things like that. And I am wearing clear frame glasses, and I've got like just below shoulder length, like dark, very dark curly hair. I want to share a little bit, like if you're not accessing my slides visually, they, rather than providing sort of a description of each of my slides, I'm just going to tell you the general theme. I chose some purple and gray and white sort of squiggly type of background things. And then the text is always over a solid block of like light color of some sort. And anytime that there is like a photo or something on my slides, I'll be describing that visually. But any text that's on the slides is going to be either said outright or sort of iterated in a specific way while I'm talking. So shouldn't be anything to miss there, but I wanted to start with that. What are we talking about today? I'm super excited. This is my favorite topic to talk about. Yeah, so I'm going to share a little bit about me and sort of what brought me to this work, the work that I do outside of that sex show. I'll share a little bit about that sex show, talk about what that was like, and kind of how that's going to inform this presentation. I'm going to talk a bit about disability justice and what I have sort of considered a pleasure politic that I've adopted for my own work. I'm going to talk about disabled sexuality, that choice of words and why I use that and what that really means. Then I'll talk about some gaps and barriers when it comes to disabled sexuality and disabled sex more broadly, things in education, stuff like that. And then, of course, what do we do with this information, the moving forward pieces. And then we'll get to our Q&A and discussion. So on this slide, there is a photo of me. I'm wearing like a cute frilly dress. I was at and some big clunky Doc Marten boots. And I'm on a field sort of situation. There's like some green foliage behind me. I was at my partner's sister's wedding, so I'm all dressed up there. And I'm using my cane because that is how I get around. And I like to put this photo in my sort of about me because I like to start off by, when I'm doing presentations like this, by talking about the fact that I'm disabled. That is sort of the first and foremost thing that I want to share about myself when I'm talking about disabled sex and disabled sexuality more broadly. It's a huge reason for why I got into this work in the first place, but also why I continue to do it now, even though sometimes it's really hard to talk about things that you might experience yourself. But it makes the work a little bit more special for me, at least in my opinion. And that everything that I bring sort of to this presentation, some of it is from research, some of it is from the work I do, but a lot of it is from my personal experience. And so that feels important to mention. My background's in recreation therapy. As was mentioned in my bio, I am a certified recreation therapist, or CTRS, as it is often known. And that's sort of where I started to explore this idea of disabled sex. For those who don't know, recreation therapy sort of utilizes recreation and leisure as a means of um, like health and wellness in a way. So sometimes they'll be in hospital settings or long-term care settings. And really the point of recreation therapy is for people to do what they love and what brings them pleasure and joy and what is enjoyable for people. And in my mind, while I was early on in school, I also had just come out as queer. And so sex and sexuality was on the brain. And so immediately I was like, well, this feels like it should be a part of recreation therapy. But there wasn't really a lot out there for me to explore that way. And so I ended up doing a master's to like a thesis-based master's to sort of explore this topic more broadly. So my master's focused on disabled sexuality, and it was very much themed around acquired physical disability and people's experiences in sort of how they experienced their sexuality pre-disability, and then once they had acquired a disability, and what sort of resources and supports were available. And like, spoiler alert, not a ton, very few, if any, for most of the participants that I spoke with. And so a lot of my work now has essentially been to create and share some of those resources, which has been very cool. But yeah, since doing my master's, I think I finished it in 2019, which is a very long time ago now. Every time I do a presentation like this, it becomes longer and longer. I since doing my research, I've sort of gained a lot of different professional expertise in this topic, but I really feel that none of it will ever come as close to the expertise I have for my own personal experiences, and that is where I work a lot from. I'm based in Chibuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, colloquially or sort of colonially known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's where I live and work and reside. And I'm going to talk a lot about systems of oppression as we go through this presentation. But for now, I want to sort of just mention that any conversations about sexuality, oppression, and systemic violence is inherently connected to the violence of colonialism. So a little bit about my work and sort of how I got into, well, vaguely how I got into doing that sex show. My main gig, the main place that I work and spend a lot of my time, is as the education coordinator for Venus Envy. We're an education-based sex shop and bookstore with locations in Halifax and Ottawa, and we sell sex toys and we sell books both on sex and also on lots of other different topics and some queer and trans fiction and things like that. But we do a lot more than that. In Halifax, especially, we're very much known as sort of a queer and trans community hub. And we've been around for 26 years now. Hooray, 26 in April is that official Venus Envy birthday for Halifax. And I think part of this is because outside of the sort of informal education that happens when people come to the store to buy something or ask for resources and things like that, we also have a whole education program, and that is my sort of main job. I run the education programs and make them happen at Venus Envy, both for Halifax and Ottawa, even though I only live really in Halifax. And we do all sorts of workshops and different types of education on lots of sexuality related topics. Some of them, some of these workshops are in store or online. And if we do them in store, they always have a hybrid online component because that feels important for me as someone who's very into access. Yeah, those can be on any sorts of topics. And most of the ones I do are very much related to disability and chronic pain in some way. But we also get contracted by high schools and universities and other businesses and organizations and nonprofits and things like that to run workshops and trainings on related topics. So around sexuality, gender, often I do the ones related to disability or sexuality within like a healthcare setting. And more recently, because of my background in recreation therapy, we've been fairly involved in some healthcare setting type of training and education and policy work, which has been really cool for me. Sometimes I'll take on separate contracts when the topic of interest doesn't quite fit, like the Venus Energy mandate, or if the hiring organization is not able to bill a sex shop, which I just think is an interesting thing to talk about. High schools, this often happens with certain nonprofit orgs and hospitals. They're not allowed to send a bill, or they're not allowed to be billed by a sex shop. They can't send money to them, so I have to do it privately, which I don't know, I think it provides some food for thought, but I'm not going to get too into that right now. And I also do some work on like training disability sector workers around sexuality education so that they're better able to provide more like casual and daily supports sort of in the area of sexuality resources and things like that. So often this looks like folks who work in like group homes or assisted living facilities or long-term care. So that they can, like sexuality comes up every day for a lot of people, and anyone who is working with people every day should have some basis of knowledge and understanding to be able to provide some resources and support. And I think I said this before. Recently, I've been able to get to work on some like policy work in relationship to sort of healthcare settings, and also some legal cases, which has been a very strange experience. I find legal stuff is very complicated, as I'm sure many of you can attest to. But it's been pretty cool, and I'm going to talk about some like legality stuff a little bit later and how that comes up in my work in this sort of field, anyways. So my work looks like a lot of different things, but I take on a lot of random projects that feel fulfilling, and I cannot name all of them in one presentation because honestly, I don't even remember half the time until someone's like, "Hey, remember when you did that thing?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah." But the most sort of wacky and weird thing that I got to be a part of was the resource that we're spotlighting today, which is that sex show. So this slide says that sex show at the top, but there is a little photo, which is just a screenshot of the webpage on AMI or Accessible Media's website. And it says that sex show at the top. There's a little photo of me sort of next to it. And then below that, the sort of page is the about page. And so there's a still of me interviewing the executive director of the Halifax Sexual Health Center. Her name is Abby Ferguson. And she is a great resource, wealth of knowledge. And I got to hang out with her and talk to her for a little bit. And there's some other writing on there that's too small for even me to read. So it's not super important right now. But yeah, this was for me, it was a really funny and strange project that I got to be a part of because I am not a TV person. Like I do sex ed. And I sort of got thrown into it by accident. I won't bore you with those details, but it ended up being a pretty important resource for a lot of people and, is being spotlighted today right now, which is pretty cool. So that sex show is both a TV show and also can be listened to as a podcast because AMI predominantly does programming for low and no vision communities. And so everything that is created with a visual also has like an audio that can be used and listened to alone without the visual component. And so you may have heard this as a podcast, you may have watched it as a show, whichever one it was, or maybe neither. And maybe now you'll be interested in checking it out. But essentially what I did on the show was I interviewed a lot of disabled community members and some content experts who aren't disabled about all sorts of topics related to sexuality. We talked about intersecting identities and dating and sex drive, relationship structures, tech, sex toys, the aging process, puberty and health and things like that. And many more topics that sort of came up naturally as it related to the disabled experience. And it was really cool to get to meet so many amazing people and hear some really incredible stories. But it was also really intense because a lot of those stories were emotional and traumatic in nature. And as a community member myself, that made it more difficult to hear, but also I think we got to connect on such a special and deep level that some of the stories and interviews that came out of this show were really moving for a lot of people, I think, because we got to connect so deeply on them. We recently won a Screen Nova Scotia Award for Best Unscripted TV Show of 2024. It feels very cool to say that I was on an award-winning TV show, which I did not think would happen. Even when we got nominated, I was like, that's cute, but we're not going to win. And then we won, and I had to give a speech, and I was not prepared to do so at all. And I maybe embarrassed myself a little, but I think it was okay. So yeah, that was the show. As we sort of move on through this presentation and I start talking about other things, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about came from working on the show and then also other work that I do in my own personal experiences. But I feel very excited that this resource exists now. And if there are specific things that you hear in this presentation and I might think, oh, hey, we did an episode on that. This might be a good way to get some knowledge and get involved. And people all across Canada and also outside of Canada were interviewed for this show. So lots of different perspectives, which was very cool. All right. So moving on a little bit to, talking about my frame of practice, essentially. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, the barriers, the gaps, the what do we do with all these things, I wanted to frame my practice and my politic, essentially, and how I approach disabled sexuality more broadly. I think it's helpful to see sort of the lens that I take when I talk about this stuff, because it also helps to describe what makes things difficult in the first place. And to address gaps and barriers, we have to know where they stem from. And so I'm going to start by discussing a little bit of the disability justice framework and what I've sort of called a pleasure politic, but there's lots of different names for it for a variety of different reasons. But I'm going to start by talking about disability justice framework. There is a little photo at the bottom of this slide, and it is a person who is in a wheelchair, but they are hanging upside down in front of a blue background. So their wheels are up in the air and their arms are above their head, and it's very cool and acrobatic. And it's a photo from a film or from a show that Sins Invalid was doing, and I'll explain what Sins Invalid is in just a second. So the disability justice framework is a framework for disability movements created by a group of disabled artists, predominantly racialized women and trans folk. And this group of people later went on to create the group Sins Invalid. So essentially, I always think of it as disability justice is sort of created by and continuously like pushed forward by this group Sins Invalid, but also other disability advocates and things like that. And so Sins Invalid is a disability justice-based performance project that incubates and celebrates artists with disabilities and specifically centralizes artists of color and LGBTQ plus and gender variant artists, sort of with the recognition that those communities have been historically marginalized even within disability communities. And their work generally explores themes of sexuality, embodiment, and the disabled body, and develops provocative work where paradigms of normal and sexy are challenged and offers instead a vision of beauty and sexuality that's more inclusive of all bodies and communities. And my main reason for using a disability justice framework mainly is that it's intersectional, and that is super important. And I will talk about some of the gaps that come from a lack of intersectionality later on. But also what I love about the disability justice framework is that it also fights systems that can produce disability through violent mechanisms. So things like colonialism, racism, imperialism, and capitalism, which we're so like all of this is so something that we're so deeply ingrained in right now. And it acknowledges that while disability is an important identity for many people, myself included, it can also be painful and traumatic. And many disabilities are avoidable, but are caused by other forms of discrimination and oppression. And Sins Invalid also challenges colonial norms of beauty and sexuality and what makes a person worthy of pleasure and sexuality. And Sins Invalid is part of what inspired me to adopt what I call a pleasure politic. And so very simply, a pleasure politic, or the way that I sort of described it, and what I frame my work through is the idea that pleasure is a human right, and we don't need to earn pleasure or the right to feel good. It's inherent. If you're alive, you should be allowed to feel good, I think. And this is where a lot of my work stems from ultimately, and a lot of the education that I do sort of adopts this politic or this idea. So the thing about adopting a pleasure politic is that it, in my opinion, is in direct opposition to capitalism and, of course, other systems of oppression. All marginalization and oppression is connected. Colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heterosis sexism, capitalism, all of these systems of oppression make decisions about who is worthy of human rights and seeks to control and punish those who don't fit into those rules. And control over sexuality and pleasure is very, very common. Expectations around procreation, who gets to have sex, for what purpose, who gets to experience pleasure. And I find that doing sex education is sort of my main job. I spend a lot of time helping people unlearn oppressive ideas about sexuality. And so I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that colonization and white European control over Indigenous people has played a major part in sexual oppression and also used sexual oppression in a very, it still does, in a very aggressive manner. And so working in this field, all of you, I probably don't have to tell you that sexuality and pleasure are often used as tools of oppression. Even though I believe sexualized violence isn't so much about sex as it is about violence, I don't think that sexuality can be completely removed from the phenomenon, obviously, because it's inherently a part of it. And puritanical ideas around sexuality and reproductive health are deeply related to capitalism. Keeping people in poverty from accessing abortion also keeps them in poverty, which is necessary to keep capitalism afloat. And these same ideas create a version of sexuality that affects disabled communities in a really specific way. And this is what I sort of want to focus on a little bit right now and why I use a pleasure politic. So disabled people are often told that they cannot or should not have sex for a variety of reasons. And some of these I'm going to talk about later. But sometimes that comes up in conversations related, what comes up a lot in conversations is the ability to reproduce and have sex in a way that offers reproduction ability. Sex for reproductive purposes usually looks pretty specific, and that way doesn't work for a lot of people. And so disabled people who can't perform that action or can't reproduce for other reasons are often considered to be, and I put this in quotation marks, sexually dysfunctional. When I was doing my master's research, I came across lots of studies, surprisingly, about sex and disability. But almost 90% of it was comparing disabled sex and disabled people to able-bodied sex and able-bodied people. And I think that the research has improved somewhat since I would have done that work, but that wasn't that long ago. Like, I think I started my master's in 2017. And so that's what the research looked like less than 10 years ago now. And the healthcare systems are still impacted and reliant on these ideas of sexual dysfunction. And sex and pleasure can be a really amazing tool for reclamation of the body and agency, but it requires a version of sex and pleasure that actually meets the needs of those who are looking to utilize it. And this is where the terminology that I use, disabled sexuality, comes up. And I began by using this in my research, and I still use it today. And really, it is sort of the big piece of terminology that I really like and hold on to. So I actively use the term disabled sexuality instead of separating the terms into something like sex and disability, because I'm trying to get away from comparing disabled sex to able-bodied sex. That choice of words is really important to me around disabled sexuality, this idea that we come to this with, not with the assumption that certain type of sex or sexuality are the norm, and rather with an understanding that sex and sexuality looks different for everyone, looks like many different things, and is meant to be explored based on needs and desires and perhaps boundaries, hopefully some boundaries as well. And relationships to our bodies and opportunities for personal agency can be really complicated for anyone who doesn't fit what is deemed good, a good body, by oppressive systems. But I find this topic comes up very, very often in relation to disability. A lot of people with disabilities often are used to a lack of agency from caregivers and disability sector workers and healthcare providers. How often do we get to say no? And how often do we get to make choices about ourselves and our bodies? And we often experience a disconnect of our body or from our body from over-medicalization, chronic pain and altered sensation, and a lack of bodily autonomy in general. And so for me, disabled sexuality offers a space for anyone, regardless of disability or not. I think anyone can use this term if they want, or change it in a way that makes sense for them. But it offers space to connect with ourselves in ways that feel right and hopefully good. For me, that's a goal. Without external expectations of what we should be doing, what sex should look like. So, yes, we're on to our first video clip, and this is something. So while I talk about this video clip, Diana's gonna get it up and ready, I believe. So some context for the video clip. This is a video of my friend and colleague, Vicki Levac, and me chatting. It's from That Sex Show. And she is a wheelchair user who does a lot of work herself around sex and disability, but also other disability advocacy in Nova Scotia. And she was interviewed on the show a couple of times, and we've worked together in a variety of different settings. But something that she shared with me during one of her interviews was her experience of sexual assault. And she explained that she had a difficult time connecting with her body as a sexual body after the assault. And so for the show, one of the things that she was offered was an opportunity to do a boudoir shoot with a local photographer in Halifax. And I'm not going to show you all of that because it's like half of the episode, but I believe it's episode 2 of the show. So if you're interested, please check it out. But this clip is of me and Vicki after the photo shoot, chatting about how it went. And there was something that she said here that I think is just a really good place to start, or, to sort of like tie in some of the things that I've just said. So I'm going to let that video play. Thanks, Diane.
Cool. Yeah, and you sort of already mentioned this, but why is it important for other people with disabilities to explore this part of their sexuality?
I think it's especially important for people with disabilities to explore their sexuality because we are told we don't have one. So we don't even know it's there until later in life. We don't have the same opportunities to explore that side of ourselves because we are constantly, like, not in a creepy way, but we are monitored. There's someone always with us. I can't go to the bathroom myself and, like, get a mirror and look down there. Like, it's, as much as I would like to, that's not something I can do. So anyway, you can explore any part of your body and what feels good and what doesn't.
Yeah, I really love that idea of, exploring your body in a new or different way than we've been told we're supposed to, or that we've been told is important by like healthcare practitioners and stuff like that.
Yeah, we need to stop medicalizing as well.
Yeah.
I'd recommend this experience to anybody, but especially people with disabilities, because it was very safe. And like I said, for one of the first times in 3 years, I felt back and comfortable in my own skin.
Yeah, Vicki is awesome. Oops, I cannot share my screen while someone else is. But yeah, Vicki's really, thank you. Vicki is super cool and a wonderful colleague and someone who does a lot of really cool work in this. And I think also is Googleable. So feel free to check out that clip. It was episode 2, I'm pretty sure. And that whole episode is really powerful. Anytime Vicki talks about stuff, it always is a really, really important and really cool stuff. So switching gears a little bit, as much as I love disabled sexuality and how it opens new meanings for what sex can be, there's still a lot of barriers to address to actually make this a reality. How do we take these wonderful ideas and actually move them into practice? And what are we working against when we try to do that? And so this is what we'll be focusing on pretty much for the rest of this presentation. And then I have another video clip later on to show you. So I'm going to start with some gaps and barriers. So the first topic that I like to discuss is the desexualization of people with disabilities and how it shows up in disabled care and sex education more broadly. So the first thing here is related to the infantilization of people with disabilities. Disabled adults are often treated like children because of the assumptions we make about their levels of understanding, and support needs and possible physical limitations. We even use terms like mental age or developmental age to refer to the level of capacity that we think they have. And the problem with terminology like this is that it furthers the idea that these adults are not actually adults. And that heavily contributes to their access to sexuality resources. When disabled adults are treated like children, they start to associate children as their peers. And there's been a handful of legal cases that I've been involved in that have arisen out of a lack of understanding here in this specific area, where a minor has been harassed or violated in some way because of the assumption that they're a viable sex partner. And I can understand why people might use the term developmental age. It's supposed to offer context about a person's level of cognition. But developmental age doesn't really mean anything. 2 different 8-year-olds are probably going to have different levels of cognition, and this can come for a variety of different factors. So we can't really base people's intelligence or cognition on arbitrary ages anymore. And really, this just leads to complicating things more for people with disabilities. The next factor in the desexualization of people with disabilities is exclusionary sex education. And this takes a couple different forms, but ultimately ends up in this sort of cyclical loop of exclusionary practices. So for example, disabled students are often removed from sex education in schools because it's assumed that they don't require the same sex education as their peers. See above what I just said about the desexualization and the infantilization. And because of this, the disabled experience isn't present in sex education. And since educators don't see disabled people in their classroom when discussing sex ed, there is an assumption that sex education for disabilities isn't necessary. And so sex education continues to lack the disabled experience, and the cycle repeats and continues to repeat. And even in more comprehensive sex education, disabled experiences aren't included in the delivery of information. How do deaf students access information about sex education without ASL? And do the ASL interpreters have the correct signs for all the different sex words? And how will the hearing educator know if the interpreter has gotten it right? Like, is there a conversation happening before that? I recently saw a presentation with a disabled sex educator who was essentially like, no, that conversation is not happening. That's really disappointing. And when we use diagrams, I feel like a lot of us use diagrams in our work if you're a sex educator or educating in some way. How will blind or visually impaired students access that information? Do we have anatomically correct models that students can actually hold and learn and feel out what things are supposed to feel like? And what kind of language are we using? Is it flowery? Is it medical jargon? Are we able to explain complicated concepts in simple, plain language? How many metaphors are we using? I'm going to talk about that a little bit later too. Are we engaging students in conversations that they can participate in, or are we talking at them? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some best practices later on. And then the last piece I wanted to touch on regarding desexualization is the lack of understanding around asexuality. I hear this all the time from disabled people, this idea that they've been forced to be asexual. And I prefer to use the term desexualization when it comes to this concept because I want to make it clear that the lack of sexuality that was assumed was oppressive in nature and ultimately put upon disabled people by external factors. Because asexuality is a valid and wonderful identity, and many disabled people identify as asexual. But there's often a rift between disability and asexual identities. I spoke to someone on the show at length about this, so I'll just offer sort of a quick notes version here. But a lot of it boils down to asexuality being misunderstood as a sexual dysfunction. So non-disabled people don't want to be associated with something that's considered dysfunctional, like what's often, and I just talked about it, that disability often is related to sexual dysfunction in some way, especially in the research. And on the other hand, the sexual revolution and sexual rights have been a huge part of disability movements for a really long time. And people who have fought for the rights as sexual beings don't want to be associated with what they believe contradicts that. And so it leaves asexual disabled people being pushed out of two communities that they should be able to be a part of easily. And this is really common among other intersecting identities as well, but I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So the next topic that I want to discuss that acts as a barrier to disabled sexuality is about consent. Something that comes up really frequently in my work with disability sectors and healthcare settings is the fact that compliance is often favored over consent. In these settings, people are expected to say yes to things, even if we don't really want to do it, and sometimes it's like, well, I don't really want this, but I know I have to, so I'm going to say yes. And I'm choosing to say yes, but was it really consent? And disabled people get really good at saying yes and fear the consequences of saying no. And often when someone has when someone has been able to say no, that no isn't necessarily respected or adhered to. And this makes it really difficult to understand consent, let alone practice it. We see the effects of this in larger conversations around sexualized violence. Rates of sexualized violence amongst disabled populations are very, very high. I think it's and one of my colleagues said this in the show as well, so it might be a little bit outdated now, but I think it was 30% of men and 40% of women who have intellectual disabilities will have been sexually assaulted in their lifetime. And the numbers also go for perpetrators of sexualized violence. They can be quite high. You know, when you aren't allowed to say no to something like a meal or medical treatment, you don't learn how to say no to sexual acts. When you have multiple caregivers who see you naked, and sometimes those caregivers switch between people without a lot of warning, you don't learn who is appropriate to be naked around. And when you say no to something and that thing is done anyways, you learn that that's how no's work. And that harms people who try to say no to you if you think, well, they said no, but when I say no, it doesn't really get listened to. And somewhat on the flip side, in larger scale consent education, how is the way we are talking about consent excluding the disabled experience? If you're an educator and you teach about consent, think about the ways that you talk about it. What sort of language are you using to indicate yes or no? What sort of communication styles are included in larger conversations about communication? When you think about substance-free consent, does that include medications that might affect someone's alertness and cognition, but that they have to be on? You know, do you know how those medications might play into someone's sexual relationship if they are always on those medications? How many metaphors do we use in our education? I'm thinking about that tea video. It's so popular. It's been around forever. But, you know, are those easy to understand when we try to relate them back to the topic at hand? Maybe for some people, but not for everybody. And sometimes like sexy catchphrases or metaphors that can be helpful in understanding a larger concept, you know, they're useful, but they lose their meaning, and they often don't apply to the disabled experience. So the next factor is related to intersectionality, or technically a lack thereof. So this is something that came up in my research a lot, specifically related to queer and trans experiences, because a lot of my research participants were queer and or trans. And this also is something I experience regularly because I am also a queer person. And so sexuality-based communities, and that's something like, you know, queer and trans communities, kink communities, they tend to be pretty inaccessible to people with disabilities. A lot of queer and trans spaces are just straight up physically inaccessible to a lot of disabled people. They just like have a staircase, which is like the simplest form of accessibility. You know, queer bars don't have ramps or accessible washrooms, often a lack of seating. And a huge lack of COVID precautions, especially now. You know, so many queer and trans events, and this is happening like in my city right now, and a reason that I don't go to them. They've completely done away with any COVID precautions whatsoever, and that is excluding a huge number of people, especially disabled people. And I have found that a lot of these spaces have started offering ASL interpretation more often, but it's not standard. It's not sort of like the expected thing. And event organizers for these sorts of community-based activities are very quick to say either this space is accessible or the space is not accessible, and don't really offer any other details with that. And my personal favorite thing is to offer very detailed access notes so people can decide if a space is accessible for them or not for themselves. And on the other side, disabled communities can also perpetuate oppression and exclusion. Disability doesn't exist in a vacuum. Disability looks like many things, and disabled people can still harm other disabled people. And I still find this very common among sort of like white cisgendered disability activists, and especially among those who have a fair amount of personal independence and bodily autonomy more generally. There's a lack of understanding about access needs that don't pertain to themselves, as well as like regular instances of racism and sexism and transphobia and other forms of harm related to identity and oppression and things like that. And I'm sure that I'm guilty of this myself in some way. I try very hard to always think about who is not included in my work, but I'm still a white person and I'm pretty mobile and I'm pretty independent. And I probably perpetuate some of these things on my own without realizing. I'm just always thinking about it. So hopefully I'm doing something to avoid it. And the last barrier that I want to talk about is the physical piece. You know, I've talked a lot about bigger picture, more conceptual ideas, things that are stopping us from accessing ideas about sexuality and education. But the physical aspect of sex is very huge for a lot of people. And I would say that 70% of my work actually addresses this piece specifically. And maybe it comes from working in a sex shop or doing sort of more pleasure-based education, but most of my work focuses on helping disabled people have sex. And a common issue that comes up is related to pain and sensation. Many disabled people experience some sort of altered sensation or chronic pain, and those are two experiences that make physical things really difficult for a variety of reasons. And I could talk about this forever, so I'm trying to keep it really like short for now. A lot of sex education focuses on genitals and orgasm as sort of like the ultimate goals for a sexual experience. And sex is so much more than that. And a deeper understanding of what sex is supposed to look like, just makes way for more bodies to be able to experience fulfilling sexual experiences. Another issue that comes up a lot is the need for physical supports. So many people are concerned about how to involve care workers in helping them get set up for a sexual experience or helping them clean up afterwards. And they don't want to be accused of being inappropriate, and they don't want to be taken advantage of. Very fair. And some people were in relationships with people who became their primary caregivers, and suddenly that relationship has changed from a sexual one to something a little bit more complicated, and they need help figuring out how to bring sexuality into that experience again. We also tend to value masturbation in sex education, like I certainly do. But many people have a hard time accessing like solo pleasure time. And how are we keeping those experiences in mind while heralding masturbation as the best form of self-discovery? Can everyone access masturbation? And what does that look like? And who has to be involved to have solo time? And the last piece here is around the myth of spontaneous sex. And I feel like if you do sex education that has anything to do with consent education, then you probably agree that sex is not meant to be spontaneous. But disabled sex especially like needs planning. And I would go as far as saying that like all sex needs planning. But we have this idea in society that sex can just like happen if the right amount of eye contact is made. And this leads to a lot of like harm being done and consent being avoided. But I can understand where this idea comes from. In movies and TV shows, like they show us this really specific view of sex. And something that I have taken upon myself in a lot of the education that I do when I'm talking about spontaneity and planning is that when you watch a TV show where it looks like spontaneous sex is happening, like that was planned. It was written out in a script. It was communicated ahead of time. It was probably choreographed. And so if we want sex to look like it does in the movies, we also have to do all the planning and the behind the scenes stuff that the movies are doing. So where do we go from here? I've just said a lot of things that make disabled sex really complicated. And, how do we get to the point of disabled sexuality being the norm? What can we do to better include disabled people and the disabled experience? And so before that, I have another video clip. So this video clip is from an interview that I was doing with a colleague of mine. Her name is Emily Martinello, and she is someone who created a comprehensive sex education program specifically for people with intellectual disabilities, and a program that trains professionals to offer this type of education. And I actually worked on this project back in like the early stages of my career, and I continue to use it to this day when I am doing that sort of training, a lot of like aspects of it. But she makes a really good point that I think is going to help us move on to the next section. So I'll let Emily talk and me now, I guess.
With me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I feel like there's a lot of myth or misunderstanding around safety equals avoiding the conversation versus actually having it.
Yes, and the risk is real. Like, I don't want to downplay that. I mean, the stats are pretty high. It's up to 80% of women and 30% of men who have intellectual disabilities are sexually abused by the time they turn 18. The problem is, as you said, people are going about that by just ignoring it or trying to close them in and limit access to sexuality instead of saying, you know what, one way we can mitigate the risk is promoting healthy sexuality and promoting healthy relationships and giving tools and giving strategies and education. And so in lieu of doing that, they're actually creating more risk.
Avoiding the conversation is not going to set people up for success, but talking about it helps people to realize when something is going wrong or when something isn't what it's supposed to be.
Again, it's lack of information, lack of education, lack of access, and lack of inclusion. And so people are being put up more likely to be at risk and more likely to perpetrate abuse, all because of a lack of education.
Right. So what
Okay. all the tech stuff. Cool. So yeah, I love this video or this clip because I love working with Emily. We've worked on a handful of projects together now, and she's great. But I think it helps to sort of set us up for the last bit of this presentation, and why we need to do better to actually work in disabled experiences into our work in some way. And that's what we're going to focus on now. So in terms of best practices, oops, lost my place. Something that I like to try to focus on is sort of the training and education piece. I really believe that any person should be able to provide accessible and inclusive sex education. And if you are finding there are gaps in your knowledge, if you're finding that you don't know how to include the disabled experience, or you're feeling like you have a lack of knowledge in the disabled experience, how will you change that? What are you going to do? And that comes from, seeking out your own training and your own education. That's really the only way that we can get more knowledge. Also, like, what kind of accessible considerations are you piecing together, are you including in the work that you're doing? And so I've talked about a lot of this throughout, and so this is meant to be sort of like a summary of a lot of the things I've said, but using plain language and accurate anatomical models to like guide information. And if we're using diagrams, like, let's keep them simple. There's so many diagrams with like a billion different things, but if we're going to use them, like, let's really stick to the things that we need to know and not get so caught up in like medical jargon. Also, ASL interpretation and captioning, very important parts of accessible information and figuring out a way to do that. And the last piece around, well, one of the last pieces around best practices is around tech and media literacy. I have a very love-hate relationship with the internet. I am always very impressed with the amount of information that youth have when I'm going into like high schools and universities and middle schools even to do sex education. They have so much information, and they are very good at using the internet to find that information. And I'm also aware that there is a lot of misinformation on the internet. But what I see happening with a lot of youth right now is that they know that they have maybe too much information, and some of it is true and some of it is not. And they're spending a lot of effort and time and energy on trying to parse through that information to figure out what is real and what's not, and who they can ask if they have a question about what's real and what's not. And so I really feel like focusing on tech and media literacy in sex education practices is really important, because people are going to use the internet, and there is a wealth of information out there that has already been found and figured out and worked on. And so we have to figure out how to teach people to use it correctly, because the internet's not going away, I don't think, probably, at least not while we're still in our careers. And let's use it as a tool and not try to shy away from it and say, well, it's dangerous here, or this is bad, or whatever. Instead, like, how do we help people figure out that on their own? And this is sort of also like best practices, but other considerations. This is the part where I never know how to title stuff. And this is something that Emily was sort of talking about and referring to in that clip, and why I like to use it to sort of like end off this conversation. If we wait until we know everything, if we wait until we're completely ready, or we feel like we have an expertise in something, we're probably going to be too late. We learn as we go. When I started in sex education, I didn't know every single thing about sex education or about sex. And I would say that now, several whatever years into my career, like, I still don't know everything there is to know about sex. I don't think anybody can. And so we learn as we go, and we figure things out, and we change and we grow and we add to our education pieces or not. But if we wait until we are 100% comfortable, or we 100% have an expertise in something, we will miss our chance and people will be put in danger. We can't avoid the conversation because we're afraid of how we are perpetuating something ultimately, I think. And there's a level of it. If you have no idea, what are you going to do to figure it out? What are you going to do to increase your knowledge? Also, the piece around representation. How are disabled experiences represented in your work? Are they in ideas alone? Like, are you someone who is not disabled that is sharing information about disabled sex? That's important. That's great. But are there role models for disabled people to see in the work that you're doing, to see themselves in? It's one thing to hear it as an idea, but it's a whole different thing to hear it from someone who has experienced something similar themselves, if not the exact same experience. And like, what can you do right now? What is something that you can do when you leave here that is fairly simple and straightforward, and something that you can literally like add to work that you're doing tomorrow? Are there myths and biases that you're perpetuating in your work unknowingly? Maybe something we talked about today that you were like, oh my God, I've definitely said that word. Now you can address it. Now you can change it. You can use a different word. You can find out other information. Like, that's a quick thing that you can do, and it's the start of the process. Are there immediate ways that you can make your work more accessible? If you tend to use a lot of like diagrams, if you do that kind of sex education or some kind of education, like, can you make that diagram a little bit easier to read? Or when you are talking about something that is sort of complicated, like consent and consent culture, is there a way that we can talk about that without flowery metaphors and, trying to get away from the point we're trying to make? Is there a way we can bring it back and simplify it a little bit? These are the things that I like to leave people with, of what is something that you can do like today or tomorrow that is going to make your work more accessible and more inclusive of the disabled experience in some way. So with that being said, I've said so many things. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I am super excited to get to answer questions. This is my favorite part all the time, because I brought in a bunch of things that I think you should know, but I would much rather talk about the things that you feel you should know. I've also added my email down there for people to take down if there is something that you want more information on or more resources on, or if you just need to get a hold of me for something related to disabled sex in some way. I would love to, and it's like, this doesn't feel like the place for it, or if your question doesn't get asked because we run out of time or something like that, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to follow up and chat more about that. So yeah, let's Q&A time. Hooray.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Someone in the chat mentioned like there's so much gold, so much important framing in what you shared, as well as really tangible tips we could walk away from.
Great.
And I want to thank the folks who have already submitted questions. And as we continue to discuss, please feel free to pose more questions. We'll keep watch of both the chat and the Q&A. So the first question is, thank you so much for your insights around how we could be restructuring our perspectives of sex and disability. More this is geared towards folks who have physical disability. And I was wondering if you have looked at neurodivergent individuals, specifically people who have autism, in terms of how they're impacted by or excluded from sexual education.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of my like personal work comes in from a lot of like more physical disability, because that is my own experience. And I experience neurodivergence in some capacity, but I find that I'm in a space where it doesn't affect my ability to access things all that much, because I don't know, my work in life seems to revolve around it in a way that makes sense. But a lot of the work that I did with Emily Martinello was mostly focused around intellectual disability, but also she does a lot of work around autism. So a lot of the work from like that training program is actually more focused on intellectual disability and autism and neurodivergence than it is physical disability. When I do workshops with community members, usually the way that I'll frame it is sort of like, here are some like, topics that come up a lot, but I want to answer the questions and focus on the topics that people bring to me. And so if someone brings up something about neurodivergence, or about like their own experience with autism and how that's impacted their sexuality, then like we talk about that. Yeah, I think something that comes up a lot is related to like nonverbal cues and communication, especially when it comes to consent conversations. And this is something that I am very aware of and do try to talk about as much as possible. That like even the simple like getting eye contact from someone or like verbal communication is not always the option for people. And so when we say like, you need a hell yes instead of a maybe or a no or a looking away or like a vague nod, like that might be someone's main form of communication. And so are we including that in our conversations around consent and sex ed more generally? I took a course some time ago where I got to create a communication board that was all related to sex. It was like the sex communication board. And that was so fun for me. And it was very hard to find like the right photos online, because I was like, it was for a class I was doing, like a short course or something. But You know, like little things like that. What sort of resources are already available? And I talk about this a lot when it comes to disabled sex more broadly. Like we have, as disabled people, we have a lot of useful tools in our system already, whether it's our mobility aids, whether it's accessible technology that helps us communicate. And so like, let's use those for sex as well, for conversations about sex. A lot of people have never thought about the idea of having sex in their wheelchair until it's brought up, where I've been like, hey, have you tried this? And they're like, oh my God, like I didn't know I was allowed to. And I was like, that is your wheelchair. Like that is your communication device. Why can't you program it to be inclusive of sex in some way? So I don't know if that answered the question, but definitely I do focus on that as well. It just depends on the situation that I'm working in.
Yeah. And I hear you saying like it also depends on who you're working with, like what the person comes to you with, and they're saying, this is what I want to experience. This is, what I perceive to be the barriers that I have, and kind of working with them one-on-one. There
Exactly.
is a question. Everyone loves the related resources that you shared. They're looking for
Great.
more resources.
Yes.
So I want to create an opportunity if you have any of it top of mind, but also you can send them and we'll make sure to share with people as
Cool.
well. But if there's any like courses or research that you would really recommend, that might be helpful.
Yeah, right. Courses and research. I'm going to write this down
Yeah.
to see if some other things come up. But there is, if you want to or can be involved with ASECT, which is the American Association of Sexuality Education and Counseling Therapies, I think. It's like AASECT. I'm pretty sure I got it right. I'm not an ASECT certified like anything. I already have a certification and I find it is useful for the type of work that I do. And it doesn't feel like I need to keep up multiple certifications every year. It feels like a lot. But to be ASEC certified, you have to do a certain number of like continuing education credits, and they're usually referred to as SARs or SARs, which I think stands for sexual attitude reassessment, which is essentially like, I don't know why they call it that. Really, it's just continuing education that focuses on sexuality. And some of those things sometimes include disability and like neurodivergence and inclusion in a lot of different capacities more generally. And so, when those come out, I always like look to see kind of what they're doing. There's also this website, or it's a program in somewhere in the States. It's called Owl Tech, like owl, like the animal, but that's not what it stands for. I can't remember, but Owl Tech, and they do a lot of like adaptive equipment, and every so often they do something related to sexuality. And so I've like been to a few of their webinars, and they were very cool. Although I felt like we were sort of doing some of the same stuff, and I wasn't sure. I was like, oh, how could I work with them more? But Owl Tech is very cool. They have a whole Instagram page where they do a lot of that stuff. There's a course I took that was like advanced sexuality, something or other. It was through the University of Guelph. They do like sort of continuing education and like advanced courses. I forget exactly what it's called, but they do have, there was a course that used to be something along like advanced sexuality. And that's where I made that communication board. It wasn't solely focused on disability, but that was my focus. And so I was able to like, make that work for me. And it was a really long time ago that I took it. And so I'm not sure if it still exists, let alone, what sort of focuses there are on it. But I'm even trying to think of just like people on the internet that I follow that are talking about sex and disability. And I'm drawing a little bit of a blank right now, but I will get back to you with that.
No,
Oh
that's
yeah,
great.
advanced approaches. Someone in the chat said it.
Mhm. That's
Yeah.
really helpful. And if folks are like me, they're scared to like navigate away and search up what you mentioned, I just want to reassure we'll collect these, we'll share them. So they'll be on the webpage with the recording as well.
Cool. Amazing. I'm writing a little note to myself to like do some searching.
So there was someone who's wondering about if you have experience doing sexual education in a group home setting and what that might look like in terms of maybe educating folks one-on-one in that setting, but also educating potentially staff in that type of setting.
Yeah. So I find so far in group home settings, I've predominantly educated staff. I find usually the community-based work that I'm doing happens in like social programs. And so people who live in group homes will go to those social programs. And those so like conversations tend to like, go that way anyways. But usually when I'm working specifically with a group home or some sort of assisted living facility, I'm often speaking with the staff directly. And was the question, how do those go? Because it
Maybe like
depends.
any
Yeah.
tips you have on how to
Yeah,
make them go
for
better.
sure. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, they go pretty well. Usually once someone has like found and reached out to me, it's because they're ready. Like they're ready to do something better. And especially the way that like, you know, if they're contracting a sex shop to do something, there's usually already an understanding of like, this is something that's important, we need to talk about, because a lot of the time it is difficult to get people to like, you know, access resources like that and fund resources like that and stuff. But yeah, a lot of those conversations, something that I try to offer to people as like a tip is like if there's someone who works in a group home setting, what are ways that they are helping people practice consent? You know, are they asking if they're allowed to, like when they're like changing someone, for example, are they offering opportunities to say yes and no to things, or are they just going to go ahead and sort of bulldoze their way through that experience and that conversation? Are they, you know, are people expected to all like eat dinner at the same time? And is that necessary? You know, like what are the rules of the group home? I also have to talk about policies and things like that when I'm talking to staff in these spaces, and because a lot of people are worried about doing harm, and some, you know, Emily had sort of mentioned that, but it comes up a lot in healthcare settings, and I do education with people who like medical students who are so worried about saying the wrong thing and making someone uncomfortable or, you know, causing harm. And I frame it in a few different ways. So what does the policy of the place you work say? And how can you make sure that you're working within that? Or does it need to be changed because it's very outdated and it has nothing to do with sexuality, and that's maybe causing some harm as well? And also thinking about people's scope of practice. So like as a recreation therapist, my scope of practice is very specific. And so if I can make sure that I'm sticking to the scope of practice while I'm having these conversations or I'm doing this work, then I feel okay. Like I'm protected, the people I'm working with are protected because we're all following these rules that have been set out by multiple people over years and years and constantly are updated and changed and held accountable, essentially. So I often think about scope of practice. This is sort of a tangential way to answer that question, but it was, I like when a question is vague because I can sort of go off on like any direction, but I'm also like, I don't know if I answered that question super well or not.
I think it's helpful to know about all the levels. Like it's how do you go about it, but then also like what are the policies, and maybe recognizing if they reached out to you, there's an initial willingness.
For sure. And actually, now that you say the levels, I realized I sort of got sidetracked by talking about the staff and didn't really talk about the people who are being supported in those spaces. And so as I mentioned, I usually in those, like the settings that I do education for community members are often in sort of like social programs or like day programs and things like that. Community sort of centric programs, even, but some of them do live in group home settings. And those are really fun. And, you know, every time I do education like that, it always starts with a needs assessment. Like I try to work very specifically and very like process oriented when I'm doing stuff like this. Always needs assessment, you know, finding out like, are there issues that have come up that you want specifically addressed? Are there questions that your like member base is already asking about? And how can we address those specifically to make sure that the information I'm giving out is useful? You know, what sort of, and I often will try to ask, like, what sort of living situations do people have? Are most people living in community independently? Are most people living in group home settings? I try to like tailor things a little bit more like that. And then when I get there, like I ask a lot of questions. I find I have very loosely structured workshops and programming and things like that that I do when it comes to this population. And also when I work with like high school students as well, I find out, you know, I come in and I say, what do you already know? What are you looking to get out of this? And I work from that. And I can improvise quite a bit because I've been doing this so like intensively for quite a long time now. So I have all these things in my head that just sort of like come to fruition when someone mentions a topic they want to talk about. But when I first started, I probably was focusing more on like, okay, these are the specific things I want to get out of this session. and then seeing what kind of feedback I got and what kind of and I'm always doing evaluative processes too, to figure out are people getting what they needed to get out of this and things like that. A fun little story, I was doing an online session for a community group, and it was very sort of early COVID, so everything was online then, and this is normally an in-person group, so it was sort of getting used to that. And I was doing a sex ed session, and it was a 4-parter, and one of the parts was meant to be about anatomy and sexual health. And for a long time, I had done a lot of focus on anatomy, thinking, well, people need to know this. We don't have a lot of opportunity to talk about anatomy. And I noticed that a person who used to share a lot and always have something to say was being pretty quiet. And halfway through talking about anatomy, I looked over to that person's camera screen, because everyone puts their cameras on in that. And that person was fast asleep. And I was like, oh, I have made a terrible mistake here. This is boring. This is boring for people. How do I jazz this up a little bit? How do I make it more intriguing and more interesting? And so that was a big push to not do anatomy lessons in that detail anymore, especially on Zoom. But sometimes it's things like that of oops, that didn't go so well. I'm going to do something else. And I love sharing that story because you don't have to be perfect at this. You can make a mistake. Sometimes it's a funny mistake. Sometimes someone has an emotional reaction and you have to deal with that. But sometimes it's just silly. Someone fell asleep and it was oops, that's sort of embarrassing for me.
No, and I love the idea, creating the space so that they're co-creating the workshop with you, with the questions that
Exactly.
they're presenting. And I also like that you acknowledge, for me, that'd be so scary. But you're I've done this for a while. And then also for other people, as they start doing this and gain more experience, you get more comfort with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So there was a question around a lot of people joining us are from the gender-based violence sector, and they're wondering maybe about some of the barriers that individuals with disabilities may face for accessing services in the gender-based violence sector, whether they're going to maybe a rape crisis center or going to a shelter, for instance.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a big one that comes up is around physical accessibility and sensory accessibility. Are the spaces that people are going for these resources, can people get into them? Is the door automatic? Is there a ramp to get in? Are there places to sit down? Is the wait room overcrowded? What are COVID safety protocols that are taken into account in those spaces, and how can you make people feel more safe and more comfortable and actually able to access those spaces? But I also think when it comes to the sensory experience of it all, what are the waiting rooms like in these spaces? Are they sensory nightmares for anybody, let alone someone who has a related sensory disability? Or I know, and this was sort of an issue earlier in COVID, where support people weren't allowed to come in for things. And I don't know if this actually was something that happened in gender-based violence settings, because I feel support people are pretty important in those settings. So maybe that was not something that was affected. But I find for people who aren't able to bring support people, it can really affect their ability to participate. Something that I heard from one of my friends. I had these 2 friends, both wheelchair users, and they used to date each other. And one was a manual wheelchair user, and one was what is the word? Mechanical. You use the thing, it drives itself. I cannot remember what that word for some reason. And in certain medical settings, the person who is the manual wheelchair user would often be spoken to, even when the conversation was about the person who used an automatic wheelchair. I really cannot think of the word for that. And it was just this reminder of the talking to the caregiver or talking to the person that you think is more able-bodied. And it even showed up when both people were wheelchair users. And I think this happens a lot with ASL interpretation, people speaking to an interpreter instead of speaking to the person that you're supposed to be having a conversation with. I think the way that you go about talking to a client or talking to a person who's accessing services can be really important. but also people should be allowed to bring a support person because sometimes we need that. There's this I was talking to someone about this recently, where there's sort of this like weighing the options of, people should be allowed to bring support people, but they shouldn't be forced to bring support people, because we are our own human beings. But also sometimes you're in a setting where like you do not hold the power in that setting. And so having a support person there can be helpful. Yeah, I feel like there's a million different things that we can do to make spaces for gender-based violence prevention and like mitigation and things more accessible. But those are the things off the top of my head that I have like heard recently that are like coming up in my brain. But there's so many more, probably.
And those are good starting points. I want to say as well, I couldn't think of the word, but Julia shared power wheelchair might be the word.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Power wheelchair. Oh my gosh, like such a simple word, and I could not get that out of my mouth or brain. Thank you.
It was a question that just came in actually, that I want to pose. Someone was wondering if you'd worked with people who are living with dementia, and I'm wondering, especially if we think about individuals who are older, if just older in general, and how they're often asexualized, but then as well if they're experiencing dementia or something else. Any best practices in terms of how to work with them and maybe address some of the myths that are imposed upon those individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I work with this population very sort of few and far between, but it does come up every so often. I'm currently working on some policy work related to this. This is like an aspect of it, but it's not the only thing that we're doing. And something that comes up a lot is people's capacity to consent. And that gets complicated when someone's cognition changes from day to day. I also find that there is, this idea, like we desexualize people of a certain age all the time, like constantly. People who are like over the age of 50, like as young as 50 are considered like not sexual beings anymore, because they're past their prime, usually of like, well, what someone would consider their prime of reproductive health. And I'm putting this in huge quotation marks. And again, like when we focus on sex being only for reproductive purposes, we miss a lot of people in those settings, and like puritanical things, and our opinions on aging and what is a good body. But I digress. Yeah, we a lot of the things that I see are I've lost my train of thought a little bit. A lot of the stuff that I see is around cognition, and how do we know when someone is like at a certain point where they can consent or not. And usually and this is where it gets difficult, because a lot of long-term care facilities, and this is if someone is living sort of in long-term care, there's different approaches for someone who's living at home. But for people who are living in long-term care, I often ask like, what are the usual ways that you assess someone's cognition? Like, how do you know where someone is at on a day-to-day basis? And is that something that you can assess before sex happens, essentially, or like while conversations about consent are happening? And is there education that needs to happen for the partners of those people, or for the families? I find families sometimes, and this happens a lot also with like youth with disabilities, that families can be so supportive and also a huge barrier to sexuality, because especially from like the familial relationship, people do not want to see their parent, their grandparent, their child as a sexual being. And so this is where a huge thing happens. And I think that educating support workers and like caregivers and things like that are just as important as assessing a person's ability to consent or not. And usually in long-term care settings, there's specific ways that people's cognition is assessed. And so, how often do you do that? And if someone is in sort of a regular sexual relationship, is that a conversation, a test or whatever that has to happen more often? Yeah, especially in institutional settings. Now I'm checking the chat a little bit too. When it comes to sort of at-home settings, actually, I was presenting at a dementia conference a couple of years ago, maybe a couple of years ago, sometime. And one of the conversations was around, like spouses and partners becoming caregivers and being afraid to harm somebody because they don't know if they can consent anymore. And there's no sort of perfect answer. There's no black or white answer here, in the same way that consent conversations can never really have a black or white answer. It's always gray area. There's always tons of moving parts. And so some of those conversations are, yeah, around like, what did your consent practice look like before? And do we need to adopt something completely revamped? And figuring out, and it is so individualized too. And this is where it becomes difficult to like offer sort of a blanket statement of like best practices, because each person who has dementia is going to experience the day differently. And when does it get to a point where maybe sex isn't safe for people anymore? Or is there a way that it can be safe? And you know, how do we figure that out? And it's broad and it's vague, and there's no perfect answer. It's just questions that I ask a lot of the time. But it is very specific to the individual and also the relationships that they're in. So yeah, it's I guess that's something to keep in mind.
I think so. And we hear that even in consent-based education, like sometimes it gets reductionist to the like yes, no, and there's so many complications to that. And we need to have the language to speak meaningfully about sex. And that depends on the person and what they're comfortable with and creating space for that. Um, I had there was a question that asks, we've spoken a little bit more about like policies and training and education at a broad level, but someone was wondering if maybe you could give an example of how it may play out logistically if there's two disabled individuals who want to be sexually active. Um, and it's not a new topic for them, but maybe they're kind of like person to person explore what that looks like for them.
Yeah. And I mean, it so depends on what people's disabilities are, how that even like impacts their sexuality, or just like what's happening around them and how that impacts their sexuality. And I think I did see that question, and I was gonna be like, okay, let me see if I can like pull out more information. No, okay, I'm just gonna go off on a tangent now. Yeah, so it really depends on, yeah, the both the limitations and like the desires that people have. This is where it's kind of fun to do the like, okay, we're doing some just classic pleasure-based sex education. Like, what do these two people want to get out of a sexual experience? Like any other person, like we're talking about it from an able-bodied experience. What do these people want to get out of their sexual experience? What tools and resources do they have to make that happen? So like, do they need sex toys? Do they need like safer sex supplies? Do they need STI testing availability? And then if we want to get a little bit deeper, like what sort of physical limitations and needs does somebody have? So if both people are wheelchair users, for example, like where will they have sex? Where's the easiest place for two people to have sex? And there are probably tools to help with that. So if one person has, you know, less mobility, maybe they usually use like a transfer lift to get into bed, they would probably use that. Maybe there is a nurse or a caregiver who has to help them get set up in that and get into bed. And this is assuming that sex is happening in the bed. Maybe it's the most comfortable place. Maybe it's not. Maybe there's another place that's better. And, you know, then looking at the other person's needs and what their limitations are and boundaries and what they will need to get physically into this space. Maybe they also have limited mobility. And so we're using this transfer, we're getting everyone into the place that they need to be in. And then if the limitations are like, you know, if mobility limitations are quite high, there are probably toys for that. If people just want to be like together, maybe they want to make eye contact while they're both experiencing something sexy and fun, touching their genitals, like, you know, they might get really close together, put a toy in the middle, like that's sex. Not sex doesn't just have to be like penis and vagina penetration. I mean, it's certainly not for me, not only because I'm queer, but you know, for a variety of reasons. Like sex can look like so many things. On the show, I was interviewing Dr. Mitchell Tepper, who is a like sort of prolific sex educator and sexologist who lives in the States. And he is also disabled himself. And he was talking about these two people, like this person that he had worked with once upon a time who was under the assumption that he would never have a physical sexual experience. And so he used to have phone sex with this woman like regularly. And I was like, that's amazing. Like that's sex too. And so if two people have like very limited mobility and, you know, maybe like physical opportunities for sex are off the table, like what are the other ways we can imagine sex to make sure that folks can experience it? I find also this question comes up and so when I work in settings with a lot of folks with intellectual disabilities or autism, the question becomes like, how do we make sure that these two people who both experience intellectual disabilities or autism or, you know, neurodivergence in some way, how do we make sure that they both have the access things that they need and the safety there? And the question is sort of answered the same way, like, what are these two people looking to get out of a sexual experience? And how are we going to get to that place? And maybe one time is talking about it with other people, and then maybe they can do it for themselves. You know, I think there's an assumption that we have to like safeguard and protect, and that sex has to look one way. But I approach this in the same way that I approach any sort of sexual experience, even for myself, of like, what do I want to feel? What do I want to get out of this? What is stopping me from doing that? And like, how can I work around this? I love troubleshooting and problem solving sex things. One of the consulting things that I do is around like sex toys and things like this, where someone will send me an email and say like, I have this toy and it's not working for me for this reason, or I have this thing I want and I can't figure out how to do it myself. And we have like a half an hour Zoom conversation and talk about all the different options that could help them get to that place. And I always say, I'm not doing like talk therapy. I am just helping someone problem solve because I have a wealth of knowledge about sex toys and positioning and different things like that. And yeah, and how the body works in ways that maybe we didn't expect. Yeah, that's helpful. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. I see claps, I see emojis in the chat.
Yay.
There was a kind of related question, maybe around like troubleshooting in part. There was a question around individuals who are neurodivergent, perhaps especially with anxiety, depression, and how to support them in being able to feel confident and comfortable discussing their needs and wants.
Oh, yeah. How do any of us get comfortable discussing our needs and wants? I mean, the way I got comfortable with it was just never shutting up about it, essentially. I always say and this is for any sex ed that I do around like communication and how to get what you want, how to say what you want, things like that. Like the practicing part is a huge piece of it. We are not set up in a society where we're allowed to talk about sex, where we're encouraged to talk about sex. And I think a lot of anxiety is caused by that this is not normalized. And so normalizing the conversations and practicing having them is just going to make it easier for everyone, regardless of what style of communication you are using, whether it's verbal or nonverbal in some way. I always talk about it as like the sex educator in me says like clit, penis, butthole, whatever, 1,000 times a day. And so if I'm asking for something related to my clit or whatever, it becomes much easier. It's still a little scarier because it's like more vulnerable when it's about me and things like that. But it is significantly easier to just be like, well, I talk about this all the time and it's easier because I said it in this way. And now I can say it in this way. Yeah, also, and this is why I love different options for communication. Some of us do not want to ask things out loud. Texting is perfectly fine. Some people call it sexting. I think it's like, hey, let's do this later. Like, is it sexting? Maybe technically. Would I do it to someone I didn't know? Of course not. But you know, with a partner that I've had for a long time, if we already have some rules set up around like when is it okay to ask for stuff, or like, is now an okay time to have this conversation? Like, hey, I wrote out this letter for you or this text for you, or I programmed this question into my communication device or what have you. But yeah, I really believe that like a lot of the anxiety and uneasiness asking for what we want or talking about our needs and boundaries just comes from a lack of allowance to do that. And so part of it is like reclaiming that allowance and saying like, actually, I have every right to ask for the things that I need in a sexual experience that I am a part of. And the other person has every right to say, no, I'm not into that. But also, yeah, like how do we practice it? Do we say it alone? Do we write it down? And that really depends on the person. So yeah, that's, I guess, what I would do.
No, I love that. And I love the recognition of different forms. I feel like my main form is I send different TikToks like late at night to communicate things about myself.
That's
so
amazing.
I can do it in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, right. Like memes, if you're into memes, if you make memes that are about your specific sexual experiences, like amazing way to bring something up to somebody. I love that.
Okay, so we're getting a little bit short on time. I want to end on a question that was brought up. They shared they went to school for recreation therapy, so feel some alliance with you there, and
Cool.
said that barely talked about sex as a joyful part of life. And I think that's probably true in a variety of different sectors, education, etc. So just any thoughts you have on how we can counter that, how we can bring up the joyfulness of sex in our everyday conversations, what type of changes you might want to see to enable that?
Oh, that is a great question to end on, and a loaded question to end on. I love it. There is, oh my gosh. I mean, I always try to think of like, how am I doing this? How am I normalizing conversations about pleasure and joyfulness and that fun stuff? And, like I think about, yeah, the ways I'm doing it myself in my personal life and how that can sort of be brought into my professional work and other people's personal lives ultimately. And something like, literally I was doing a values clarification activity with my therapist recently, and they gave me two different activities to do. And for both of them, pleasure was the top priority. And I was like, well, that says a lot about me. But I kind of love that, because the way that I use pleasure is for feeling good and for experiencing joyfulness and for like getting all those good feel good chemicals and things like that. But also it's a way to cope with the horrifying world around us and the horrifying things happening around us, and the like difficult things that we experience, or a bad day, or like, oh my gosh, I'm menstruating right now and this is bad and I just want to experience pleasure in some way. I also, and when I say pleasure, I don't just mean sexual pleasure. And this is from that like rec therapy background. And I'm so happy. I love that someone else is either a rec therapist or was doing rec therapy school and now has moved on to something else. Totally fine. All of it is useful, I think. But yeah, like pleasure can look like a lot of different things. And sometimes going straight to like sex as pleasure can be a lot for a lot of people, especially for folks who've experienced trauma, or who don't have a super strong relationship with their body for any variety of reasons, and or a complicated relationship with their body for any variety of reasons. And so my question is always, where do you experience pleasure in other places? What are those simple pleasures that, like, you're on the bus, you have to take the bus, the commute is hell, but you're listening to music and that music slaps, and like that hopefully is pleasurable even amongst all the crappy smells and experiences that happen on a public transit bus. Or like you have to get up early in the morning. I say this about myself, I'm not a morning person. If I have to get up early in the morning, the first thing I'm doing is having coffee, because I love coffee. And like, sure, the caffeine is probably doing something to help me wake up, but really it's just like, I want this sweet treat. My coffee has some sweetener in it, I use like a caramel cream or whatever. Like that is a treat for me. I wake up, I get a treat. I am very treat oriented and treat motivated. And I feel like that comes from this like pleasure seeking behavior. I love saying the words pleasure seeking behaviors. I feel like so often it is talked about from like a DSM, like bad thing or like a symptom of something. And I'm like, no, this is how I live my life. It's fun. But also something that I read recently with someone reminding people that our right to pleasure doesn't supersede our expectations to community care and to each other. And I think that this is very important in like a consent conversation as well. But, in this world that we live in, like, of course, we're trying to use pleasures for coping with these difficult things, with these horrifying acts that we're seeing displayed around us constantly. And we can't say, well, I don't have the energy for that, I'm just going to go masturbate instead. Like, there is a mix of these things. There is meant to be like we do the hard thing and now we get a treat. We don't have to earn the treat by doing the hard thing, but we should be able to balance out in a way that, to balance our expectations for each other. And they don't all have to look the same. Like, maybe you're not someone who can access protests because you can't stand up for a long time. And being like in a solitary chair in a protest is like kind of a dangerous thing to do, depending on who you are and what you look like and what your experience is. But there's other ways to involve yourself in important work that's happening and making sure that everyone has human rights. And so, you don't have to do it to earn your pleasure, but think about, while we deserve pleasure, so does everyone else. And if we're not working towards that, then it's a bit too self-serving in a sense. And believe me, like, I'm pleasure seeking. I'm all about that self-serving behavior, but I'm also looking to help people seek their pleasure too. And so it's all interrelated for me. And I feel very important to talk about that. We don't have to earn our pleasure, but we should also be helping people find theirs and their rights and things like that. So hope that was a useful topic to end on.
I think so. And I think it's a good, like, thank you everyone for attending this learning. Thank you so much for the nuggets that you've given us, Rachele. I think it's one thing we can walk away with too is like, I've done this great learning. Maybe I can seek some pleasure in whatever way that looks like for me after this.
Yes.
And I just want to give you a reminder before you do that. There is an evaluation after. So it's going to pop up in your browser. And you can share feedback and we'll share that with you as well, Rachele.
Great. I
And,
love evaluative processes.
perfect. And then after you complete that, you can get your certificate of participation, which I know can be helpful for professional development portfolios and things like that. And otherwise, I just want to say thank you so much, and we'll see everyone at the next Spotlight.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thanks for having me. Yay.
Of course. Okay, bye for now.